The Foundations of Business Strategy, Session 3, Analyzing Industry Structure. Hello, I'm Professor Michael Lennox, and today we're going to be talking about industries and how the industry structure affects profitability. I'd like to begin today with a story not of an individual firm, but of a whole industry, the U.S. airline industry. Back in the late 1970s, under President Jimmy Carter, we had a deregulation of this industry. Historically, an industry that was heavily regulated in terms of who could enter and the like. After deregulation, it allowed for other firms to enter into this industry. We have seen over the course of the last 30 years entry by hundreds of different carriers. We've seen exits by nearly hundreds of different carriers. It's been an industry characterized by bankruptcies and by firms that have just simply been struggling. Why is this so? Why is this an industry that has struggled so greatly in the face of the competition that it faces? So why has the U.S. airline industry been such a brutally competitive industry? Well, maybe it suffers from our fundamental principle of business strategy that we talked about last session. If everyone can do it, it's difficult to create and capture value from it. But is that the case here in airlines? It doesn't seem likely to be an industry where everyone can do it. It requires large capital investments. It's a highly technical industry at the end of the day. So why do we see it be so brutally competitive? In a perfectly competitive market, no firm realizes economic profits or rents, but how do we analyze whether an industry is in a perfectly competitive market or not? Now, you might recall from our last session that we talked about three different perspectives on when economic rents exist. We have the idea of a monopoly rent, or from the industrial organization view, Ricardian rents, the idea that there's barriers to imitations, and then finally Schumpeterian rents, which relate to the dynamic capabilities of firms over time. Today we're going to specialize and look in detail at this idea of monopoly rents, and in particular this role of industry structure. Now, we talk about the industrial organization perspective once again coming out of economics. As we see on the chart to the right here, we highlight the idea that the perspective suggests that there are various barriers to entry that prevent a shifting out of the supply curve and a lowering of prices. The premise here is that industry structures matter most, that there are some barriers to competition here that allow for these monopoly rents that we talk about. And ultimately, that some industries are simply more profitable than others. Here we see some data illustrating this point. On the left axis, we have return on assets, one measure of profitability, the returns, the income of the firms over the asset base of those firms. This is now averaged across those players in the industry, and this is data from 2008. So on the left-hand side, we see highly profitable industries like medical products and equipment, network and communications equipment, pharmaceuticals. And we can hypothesize why these are such profitable industries. On the far other extreme, we see other industries, real estate, and then at the very, very bottom, airlines. So how can we analyze this? How can we understand why there are some industries that are highly profitable and others that are not? It's clearly not all just about demand for products and services in those industries. So what determines these distributions? Well, to help us make headway on this, I want to introduce another tool in our strategist toolkit, 5 Forces Analysis. This is a classic strategy tool devised by Harvard professor Michael Porter back in the early 1980s. And the idea very simply is that there are 5 competitive forces that prohibit or inhibit firms and industries from being profitable. On one hand, there's the threat of entry, other competitors entering into a market and increasing competition within that market. The threat of substitutes, of substitute products and services that compete directly with the products and services in that market. We think about bargaining power, both up and down the supply chain, the bargaining power of suppliers, and then, of course, the bargaining power of buyers. We'll talk more about each of those. And then finally, there's the idea of intensity of rivalry. Given the existing competitors within the industry, some industries have more intensity of rivalry than others. Why is that? How can we think about that and analyze that? So to start off with, let's talk about the threat of entry. In some respects, you could argue the most important of the 5 forces. What are ways in which we might prevent entry into an industry? Now, this is a very important point. An industry is more attractive when entry is more difficult. Now, you might be tempted to say, oh, because it's easy to enter, that makes it more attractive. But that's exactly the wrong logic here. And it relates to an old joke that used to be said that I don't want to be a member of a club that will have me as a member. In essence, the problem is if it's easy to enter, it means it will be a highly competitive market. So we'd rather be in an industry that others struggle to enter into. So the industry is more attractive when entry is less likely. Now we can think of a number of different things that might impact why entry might be less likely. As we talked about in the last session, there might be legal barriers to entry, such as patents or copyrights and the like, that simply prevent others from entering the industry. But there's a number of other factors we want to consider as well. The first one we want to consider: to what degree do potential entrants face high sunk costs? Now, I am using the particular term sunk costs here, and this is a very important distinction. One might be tempted to say there are high barriers to entry simply because it costs a lot of money to get into that industry. However, if this is truly an attractive investment, an attractive market to enter into, one would expect you to be able to raise funds, no matter how high the cost, to be able to enter into that market, if there is a positive return on your investment. What's important, actually, is the degree to which those investments are sunk. Now, sunk costs are investments that cannot be recovered. Classic examples would be things like research and development, the building of a factory that's very, very specialized for a particular technology or industry. So on one extreme, you could imagine the building of a big box store that if it doesn't work out for you, you could sell it to another tenant who could come in and retrofit it for perhaps another retail establishment or another industry. On the other extreme, there could be then those types of investments, factories and the like, that are incredibly specialized. You think of the semiconductor industry, where it requires a very specialized fabrication facility to be able to produce those microprocessors. This degree to which these investments are sunk creates a barrier to entry because they create a higher risk to those who enter that industry. This is not an industry with high sunk costs that you can easily enter and then exit and recover your costs, recoup your costs. So as a result, a high sunk cost creates greater risk for entering in the industry, and that greater risk raises the profitability assumptions that you need to enter, and as a result creates a potential barrier to entry here. So you might have heard in other classes and in other experiences that sunk costs should be ignored, and that's very true once you incur a sunk cost. However, before you incur a sunk cost, you want to think about how that affects your risk profile here. And once again, higher sunk costs raise your risk because it's harder to back out of those investments and can act as a potential barrier to entry. Second thing we want to think about: whether incumbent firms have a competitive advantage. Obviously, if incumbents have a competitive advantage, it's going to be very hard for entrants to compete and survive and be profitable in that industry. Now, these sources of a competitive advantage for incumbents can come from many different sources. It could be, once again, legal barriers such as patents and licenses, but in many cases, it might be other less restrictive types of competitive advantages. So, for example, pioneering brands. We can all think of firms whose names have become synonymous with the products that they sell. Google, you do a Google search. Make a Xerox, use a Kleenex. In any of these cases, it could be argued that the brands themselves have value that make it very hard for others to enter and compete in those markets. I always like to tell my students, though, to be cautious in how far you push brands as a logic for a barrier to entry, simply because the history is littered with many examples of successful brands that eventually find themselves outcompeted by rivals who come in with some new novel concept or innovative product offering. Third thing to think about in terms of competitive advantages as a barrier to entry are things called pre-commitment contracts. These are various ways in which the existing players within the industry lock out potential entrants from important complementary assets. A classic case of this would be distribution channels. So take the airline industry. In some airports, one airline might be able to lock up most of the gates, not allowing others then to enter and use that airport as a place to fly out of. They, in essence, lock up the distribution channel, preventing entry into that segment. A fourth thing to think about are economies of scale. The larger the economies of scale, the greater the barrier to entry within an industry. So let me talk about this one in a little more detail here. The idea of economies of scale is simply, as output increases, the larger the output that you have, average costs go down. We talked a little bit about this in the last session. So what you see here is a little chart where you have AC stands for average cost. We have prices or costs on the y-axis and output on the x-axis, the horizontal axis. And as you see, as you increase the volume of your output, the per unit cost goes down. There's eventually a point that we refer to as the minimum efficient scale, the MES. The minimum efficient scale is, in essence, the amount of output necessary to be cost competitive within the industry. Now it's interesting, a lot of this might be generated just simply by the technology inherent in the industry, and there's those who've done analyses to show what the minimum efficient scale is in various different industry segments. In the mass-produced beer segment, for example, the minimum efficient scale to be cost competitive in that segment is actually quite large, in the order of millions of barrels that need to be produced of beer to be cost competitive. In other industries, it might be very small, and you can just get a small chunk or percentage of the market share of an industry and have enough volume to be cost competitive. And you can actually find resources, indexes, that will tell you what the efficient scale is in various industries. Related to economies of scale is the notion of learning curves, or sometimes called experience curves. And the idea here is the steeper the learning curve, the greater the barrier to entry. Learning curves look a lot like economies of scale, but they have a slight and important difference. Learning curves are generated by the cumulative output over time, not just the volume of output in any given production cycle. The idea very simply is that over time, as you produce more and more, you learn. You learn how to do things more efficiently, you lower your costs, perhaps improve your quality. It's not hard for all of us to think of many examples perhaps in our own lives where the more you do something, you get more proficient and better at it. Lots of industries have learning curves at the heart of their dynamics. One in particular that's interesting is the semiconductor industry, which has found over time that there is a steep learning curve in which you move down that learning curve, lowering your cost structure. For later entrants into the industry, they have to move down that learning curve to catch up to existing competitors within the industry. And that time it takes you to catch up to those competitors serves as a barrier to entry. You realize perhaps as a potential entrant, you'll never be able to catch up with them, and as a result, you don't enter in the first place. Here we see some data from the semiconductor memory industry, an industry that has been characterized by what's called Moore's Law, the idea that there's a doubling of capacity roughly every 18 months. And this is a rule, if you will, a law that has been followed for going on 20, 30 years now. And what you see here is a representation of that in terms of cumulative output and the price per bit. This is on a log scale, so actually this is a much steeper dynamic than is even illustrated in this diagram here. And what you see is that over time, as output was accumulated, the price per bit has come down quite dramatically here over the years. This learning curve is in essence what has allowed Intel to be a very successful player in the microcomputer industry. As they've gotten ahead and competed and learned, they've lowered their costs and have been able to prevent many entrants from coming into the industry and competing with them because it would be just cost prohibitive for someone to try to catch up with them at this point. Third thing to think about in terms of entry is the degree to which a potential entrant actually faces retaliation. Now, what do we mean by retaliation? We mean that the strategic behavior of the incumbent firms in the industry will try to basically force those entrants out of the market. The easiest thing to think about is in terms of pricing. Will they engage in a price war that will force down profits and hopefully then drive out the entrant from the industry? Now, not all firms are able to do this. There's a number of things we need to think about to the degree to which a firm can use retaliation, an incumbent firm, to stop entrants from entering. One thing to think about is the excess capacity of the existing players within the industry. Consider the following. Consider I'm a highly successful business and I have a plant and it's running at 100% capacity. There's a potential entrant that's going to come in and I decide I'm going to try to cut my prices to raise my demand. Well, if it's going to take me time to build up additional capacity, maybe I have to build a new plant and the like, in the short run, all a price cut will do is basically lower my profits. The new potential entrants can still come in and try to grab demand, maybe even at a higher price, because I am unable to meet the additional demand that's created from the lower prices that I'm now charging. On the flip side, if I have excess capacity, perhaps I'm running a manufacturing plant at only 60% capacity, and I have room to increase my output, then a price cut will then increase my demand. I can meet that demand because I have this excess capacity, and it allows me then to fight off these rivals who might be potentially trying to enter the industry. The airline industry suffers from this, especially during economic downturns, where there's often more capacity for airlines than there is demand for those airlines, especially seats on individual flights. And so there's incentives then to cut your prices to try to get more passengers in any given flight on any given plane. And that, as a result, lowers the prices and makes it more competitive. Second thing to think about are these economies of scale and other cost advantages I talked about previously. Not only do they just give you an absolute cost advantage, they also might allow you to engage in this type of pricing behavior and sustain the type of pricing behavior longer than potential entrants who might not enjoy those cost advantages. Third thing to think about are exit costs. Now, what are exit costs? Exit costs are payments that must be made upon the exit from an industry. Often when you want to shut down a business, there are still costs that are incurred. Perhaps obligations that you've made in the past to pension funds and the like that must be met. Perhaps there is an environmental liability associated with a manufacturing plant that you have that you'll need to meet if you shut down that plant. Those exit costs actually provide an incentive to fight, because it might actually be in the decision calculus of the existing incumbents that while they might not be profitable, that exit is still more expensive than cutting their prices and fighting those potential entrants in the short run. So substantial exit cost increases the likelihood that a firm will want to fight potential entrants. Fourth thing to think about is simply, do some firms have an aggressive reputation? Do they have a reputation that they are going to respond to any potential entrant into their industry? Now, a famous example maybe in the software industry is Microsoft, who is well known for having a strong reputation for retaliation when firms try to potentially enter their industry segment. The key is it must be credible at some level. Just saying that, hey, we're going to be aggressive against potential entrants into our segment is insufficient. You must actually be able to back that up. And that actually goes back to some of the things we've already talked about. Do you have a cost advantage here? Do you have excess capacity? They all feed into whether you have an aggressive reputation. The challenge here is that unless you have a large position with the industry, a large percentage of the market share per se, you have what we call a free rider problem. One firm being aggressive to potential entrants in the industry is insufficient if others who are already in the industry don't respond in kind as well. So one could imagine if I try to engage in a price war, if no one else joins me in that, all I'm doing is hurting my own profitability potentially, especially if I don't have that excess capacity once again. So once again, likelihood of retaliation is something else we want to think about in terms of threats to entry. Let's continue to move on. Let's consider the threat of substitute products, and how that might undermine profitability within an industry. So industries are more profitable when substitute products are less of a threat. So what determines how much a substitute product is a threat? Well, the gold standard, the thing we really like to think about, is the cross-price elasticity of demand. We want that to be low. So a classic example of a high cross-price elasticity would be something like margarine and butter. Arguably, as you raise the price of margarine, you're going to increase the demand for butter. People will substitute from one product to another. An interesting question would be, what's the cross-price elasticity of demand for beer versus wine? If we raise the price of beer, how many people switch to drinking wine at that point? Here we see this graphically. So define cross-price elasticity as the ratio of the percent change in demand for one good given a 1% increase in price of another good. On the one extreme, we have perfectly, infinitely elastic demand. The idea here is that as we change the price just a little bit, we see massive shifts in demand. It's probably easiest to think about this with a slight slope to it. So if we increase the price just a little bit, we suddenly see all the demand disappear as people move to the substitute product. On the other extreme, on the right side, we have perfectly inelastic demand. And here is the situation where as we raise the price for one good, it has absolutely no impact on the demand for the other good. So a perfectly inelastic demand would be a more favorable situation here, as people aren't substituting away to other products. And then, of course, we have everything in between in terms of these trade-offs. Now here's a little trick that I learned while I was a doctoral student of a way to remember this idea of elastic versus inelastic demand. It's an important concept when thinking about how much pricing power you might have within an industry. Elastic demand forms an E on the scale, and inelastic demand forms an I for inelastic. Hopefully you find that useful then when you're trying to think through. Horizontal means elastic, that's actually not good. Inelastic is preferable, the I that's formed here. The second thing to think of, beyond just the elasticity of demand between various substitute products, is the degree to which there are switching costs. Switching costs are the one-time costs consumers incur from switching from one product class to another. I used to teach at NYU, and while I was there, I'd always like to ask my students how many of them don't know how to drive. It wasn't uncommon to have a few students who grew up in New York City who never learned how to drive. They never needed to. They could always take public transportation and the like. Imagine them now traveling on a business trip to another city, let's say San Francisco, where they're debating whether to rent a car or to take a car service. Well, that rental car is a very high switching cost because they simply do not know how to drive. And the costs for them to learn how to drive are quite onerous. They might have to take lessons, they obviously have to get their license. High switching costs to switch from that one product class, car rental, to another, public transportation or car service and the like. We can think of lots of other industries where there might be these types of switching costs between one standard or one product class and another. Of course, there's others where the switching costs are negligible. I go back to my beer and wine case. If you're at a restaurant and you choose to order a wine or a beer, the switching costs are nothing or negligible here. So something else to think about when thinking about the degree to which a substitute can be a potential threat. Third thing we should think about is the bargaining power of buyers. This is once again the degree to which those who we sell to have the power to argue, in essence, you could think of, for lower prices. So what drives this bargaining power of buyers? Well, the industry is more attractive when buyers have less power, and there's a number of things to think about. First thing to think about is the degree to which the buyers are not concentrated. This is what we call monopsony, would be when the buyers actually have bargaining power here. And ultimately, it's a numbers game. Think about the idea of scarcity once again. If I am one of the few suppliers of a desirable good, and there's lots of buyers out there, one could imagine that I have a lot of bargaining power now over those who are seeking my products. Flip it around the other way. What if I am one of many different sellers of a good or service that there's only a limited number of buyers for? That puts the bargaining power with those buyers. So if you think about relative concentration in this number game, we could have situations where there are few suppliers and few buyers. This would be a situation we call mutual dependence here. It's unclear who would have bargaining power here. There could be situations where there are many buyers and many suppliers, and this would be your typical competitive outcome where no one has any real bargaining power and you might just have simply a market price that prevails within the marketplace. But the off diagonals are where things get interesting. If there are few suppliers and many buyers, we refer to that as monopoly power. If there are few buyers and many suppliers, it's what we call monopsony power. An example of monopsony power might be the federal government when it comes to procuring arms for planes and other types of weaponry there. There is one buyer, potentially in the US government, and there might be many suppliers of those goods and services in the economy, let's say within the US, in the US alone. So first, once again, the degrees to which the buyers are concentrated. If they're not concentrated, that works in favor of the industry. The second thing is the degree to which buyers have options. The fewer the options they have, and this gets back to scarcity again, the more bargaining power you have. So how do we think about options? Well, the first thing is to think about to what degree are products differentiated. If there's a high degree of differentiation, that works in favor of the industry. It prevents buyers from taking one product and playing off another in terms of what they're looking to buy. What we might think of as low intra-industry, within industry, cross-price elasticity here. So the degree to which there might be product differentiation or geographic differentiation, that's going to work to the industry's favor. To the extent we have what we might call commodity products that all look exactly the same, have the same features and the like, that's going to work to the buyer's favor here in terms of pricing and the like. Second thing to think about within options is the switching costs once again. So we can think about switching costs across product classes, as I originally talked about, beer, wine, and the like. But you can also think of that within a product class. Classic example would be the personal computer industry, where to switch from an Apple-based operating system to a Windows-based operating system is actually quite onerous. There's quite high switching costs in just simply learning the new operating system, perhaps changing your software, and other things that you would need to do to make that switch. We refer to this in economics as relationship-specific assets. If you have made investments that lock you into one potential supplier versus another, that is going to give power to that supplier. Another classic case here is if you're a coal mine and then you have a coal processing plant. If you locate that coal processing plant near the coal mine, well, now you've really locked yourself in, because it's going to cost you a lot to relocate your plant near another coal mine, and it gives bargaining power to that coal mine. Another thing to think about is the degree to which the buyers can backward integrate. And what do I mean by this? I mean that the buyer could actually move up the supply chain, value chain, and start doing what you do. Now, let's think about Coca-Cola. What are the chances that your average consumer could go backward integrate and start to consume or make their own soda product? Highly, highly unlikely. However, imagine now the buyer is someone like McDonald's with a lot of scale and a lot of demand. It might not be unreasonable that when you're bargaining with McDonald's as Coca-Cola or Pepsi, that they have a threat here of backward integrating into what you do. And that backward integration threat gives them bargaining power in that relationship, perhaps allowing them to argue for lower prices than obviously the average public would pay. Third thing to think about are the degree to which buyers are segmented. Price information is often not widely available, and because of that, it allows for businesses to segment their buyers based on their preferences. Consider the following in terms of what we call price discrimination. Here we see a traditional supply and demand chart here. Supply increasing, demand decreasing in quantity, quantity on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical axis. As we talked about previously, price and quantity for that market is determined where supply crosses demand, so you see PC and QC for this industry. Those two lines help determine what we call the producer and consumer surplus. In essence, if you think of that demand line as individual consumers who each would be willing to pay the amount where price crosses that line, one can think about the PC, the price that's actually charged, is lower for many consumers than what they would actually be willing to pay, what we call the willingness to pay. So the producer gets a surplus above and beyond the supply curve. Their price is higher than their supply curve, what they're willing, their costs are. But for consumers, it's also a surplus because for some of those, especially those further to the left, would be willing to pay a much higher price for the product than they end up having to with just one price set for the market. What price discrimination is when the firm is able, in essence, to charge different prices to different consumers in an attempt to grab that consumer surplus. So you see here, what if you could charge a different price to different consumers based on what their preferences are? This is in essence what the airlines try to do when they have different rates charged for whether you have a Saturday night layover or not, or whether you're ordering your tickets 21 days in advance or not. They know that if you don't have a Saturday layover, you more likely are a business customer, and as a business customer, you might be getting reimbursed by your employer, and as a result, your price demand is actually higher. You'll be willing to pay a higher price for a desirable flight than you would if you were spending your own money. So this is various ways in which they try to capture some of this consumer surplus. Now, in a first degree price discrimination, perfect price discrimination, you're able to charge exactly the price that each person demands. This is what auto companies try to do when they haggle. If they're really good at what they do, they figure out what each customer is willing to pay and charge them exactly what their willingness to pay is for the product, capturing their consumer surplus. Second degree price discrimination are ways in which you split the way you charge for products that will cause what we call self-sorting, that people divide up into different groups. In essence, the idea again in airlines where you might have a different fee, different charge, whether you have a Saturday night layover or not. So take the following example here. Imagine this is your following demand curve here. So think of our supply and demand charts now with a little bit of a step function in there. If you charge $60, you will sell 1 million of these units for, let's just say, a profit of 60 million for argument's sake. Let's say there's no costs here. On the flip side, you could charge $20 a unit and you'll now sell 3 million. So you'll sell more at a lower price, as one would expect, but your profits are the same here for 60 million. Well, what if you could charge the 1 million group $60 and the remaining 2 million group $20? Well, now your profits would be $100 million. This is the essence of price discrimination once again, and it relates back again to what type of bargaining power you might have. Finally, there are different ways you might sort by groups, and you see this by businesses quite often. They might recognize that educators pay a different different price for computers, let's say, than businesses and the like. What you see here is some data on what we call bundling, another form, if you will, of price discrimination, in which if you recognize there are different types of consumers and if there's a different set of products, each with a different value, the WTP stands for willingness to pay for the product between those different groups, you can actually get a situation where bundling those products together, making customers or giving customers the option of buying, in this case, products A, B, C, D together, can actually raise the total revenues that you bring in, increase your profits as a result of that. It's beyond our lesson today to really dive into this notion of bundling, but I just wanted to highlight it again as another way of thinking about bargaining power. The degree to which bundling is possible gives bargaining power back to the industry. Let's move on from buyers now to suppliers. Very simply, suppliers are the mirror image of buyers. What you want of your buyers are not what you want of your suppliers. So for the industry to be more attractive, your suppliers are less of a threat when now your sellers are not concentrated. You don't want to have a monopoly supplier of some good or service that you absolutely need who could basically charge you a lot of money to be able to access that supply. You now want to have many alternatives. Now, while before we talked about the buyers having few, you want to have many alternatives in terms of where your supply comes from. You want there to be many substitutes for your supplier products. You want, in essence, this commodity situation. You want to face low switching costs when you turn to your suppliers, and you want suppliers who cannot forward integrate into your business. It would have to be very difficult for them to move into your marketplace, removing that threat. Third, you want sellers not to be able to differentially treat different segments of the market. You want pricing information to be widely available and price discrimination to be limited, if not possible at all. In other words, you want a competitive market for your supply as a way to lower the prices you pay for your supply and avoid some of this bargaining power that you might face from suppliers. Take, for example, the personal computer industry. If you're a personal computer manufacturer, you have a huge threat to you from basically the Wintel monopoly. If you don't work with Windows, with Microsoft, if you don't work with Intel and their processors, you're likely to have what is determined to be an inferior product on the marketplace there. That monopoly power that they in essence have gives them incredible bargaining power in that marketplace and in that segment. Final thing we want to think about is the intensity of rivalry. Given the existing competitors within the industry, how intense is rivalry? Number of things to think about. The industry is more attractive when rivalry is less intense. One thing that is often difficult that I find that students to get their hands around is the fewer the number of competitors in the industry, the less rivalry is an issue. We all know of classic duopolies like Coke and Pepsi, and we want to say these are high rivalry situations because Coke and Pepsi are fighting for position. But think of the following. If there was a third competitor amongst Coke and Pepsi, would it be higher rivalry or less? To the idea of competition and competitive rivalry, it would be even higher. If you had another, even higher. The fact of the matter is a lot of small number industries, while they look like they have high rivalry as these companies jockey for position, are actually usually very, very attractive. Coke and Pepsi, great example. Two very successful companies in a very small concentration market here in terms of the number of competitors. So the first thing we want to look at again is the number of competitors in the industry is small. There's a number of ways we can measure this. One way is simply, of course, trying to count the number of competitors. That's often very hard when you have a large distribution. The other things you want to think about are things like the concentration of firms in the industry. There's a number of ways we can measure that. One is what we call the Herfindahl index, which is the sum of the squares of the market shares of the firms in the industry. So in the extreme, in a monopoly where someone has 100% market share, that would be a 1, and you can imagine working down from there. We also sometimes look at the 4-firm concentration ratio, which would be the sum of the market shares from the 4 largest firms within an industry. So you look at something like the beer industry, you have a very large 4-firm concentration ratio amongst the mass-produced beer manufacturers. Other industries, take wine for example, the 4-firm concentration ratio is actually very, very low as it's a very distributed industry. Second thing you want to think about in terms of rivalry are what are the incentives to fight? In essence, what is the incentives for the 2 or more firms within the industry to be fighting with each other? And when we think of fight, probably the easiest thing to think about in terms of pricing, whether there'll be incentives to try to lower your prices to gain market share within the industry. So what are some of the things that push back on that? What are some of the things that push back on firms fighting for their lives by lowering their prices and ultimately destroying margins, as we talked about in our example with the t-shirt vendor in our last session? Well, one thing to think about is whether there's just simply substantial market growth. Basically saying this is a growing market opportunity and everybody can do well without having to be so aggressive in terms of pricing. This is especially important with various firms are capacity constrained. It's the idea again that even if I lower my prices, I can't meet the additional demand that I face, so I'm not incentivized to lower my prices. And as a result, we can all do well as the market continues to grow. This point about differentiation again. So opportunities to differentiate not only gives you more power over your buyers, but it also lowers some of the competitive threats within the industry, these threats to fight one another in terms of pricing and the like. You're basically kind of dividing up the market, if you will. Exit costs, now here's kind of a somewhat of a catch-22. High exit costs increase the incentives to fight for potential entrants, which is a good thing for the industry, but they also increase the incentives to fight those within the industry, which is not an attractive thing. And so you have to kind of balance some of these forces here. So low exit costs lower the incentives to fight, and that's a positive for the industry. And then finally, little excess capacity here. And as we've said before, excess capacity can be a source of a barrier to entry because it gives you incentives to try to retaliate against potential entrants. But it has this flip side as well, that it might increase the competition within the industry as well. One thing to think about is why there is or is not excess capacity is to what degree is demand cyclical? Does the demand vary over different seasons of the year? Does the demand vary over the business cycle? Automobile manufacturers suffer from a strong relationship to the business cycle. When we go into recessions, most people can delay their auto purchases. As a result, we often have massive excess capacity during a downturn in the economy. As a result, auto companies often get very aggressive with pricing, giving various types of incentive programs and the like to try to get people to buy their products and services, which of course really hurts profitability in an industry. We can also think about cyclicality of demand over different types of seasons and the like. Here in a college town, we have very high demand for hotel space, but in very limited times of the year. So one can imagine during the time of football games and during times like graduation, there is a very strong demand for hotel space in a college town. But yet on any given Tuesday, let's say in the middle of summer, demand is very low. As a result, there's very strong pricing pressure during those low demand periods there, and it makes it very hard to compete in those periods. Third thing to think about is the degree to which coordination is feasible here. There's a couple things to think about here. There's, of course, explicit price and market fixing, but I do not want to advocate this because in many situations, obviously, this is what we call an antitrust violation. You're not allowed to coordinate with your rivals to just simply try to hold prices high. So instead, we often talk about tacit coordination, various structural things that allow prices to stay higher. So what is this value of coordination? Well, let me just quickly run through some graphs here and a little bit of calculus as I did in our last session. Last session we talked about this idea of a price taker. We talked about the way to maximize profits is to take the derivative of our profit function and set it to zero. And we had a decision rule that said set quantity such that price equals marginal cost. Well, for a monopolist, it's a slightly different situation. As a monopolist, you not only get to choose your quantity, but you also get to choose your price. So the decision rule of marginal revenue equals marginal cost, if we take the derivative of the revenue and the derivative of cost and set them to equal zero, still holds. However, our equation is slightly different here in terms of what marginal revenue actually means. It doesn't actually mean price. It actually is this slightly more downward sloping demand curve that we see, or curve that we see on our chart here. So MC, once again, is marginal cost, AC is average cost, D is demand, MR is your marginal revenue. Decision rule set quantity such that marginal revenue equal marginal cost, but you charge the price that you can bear from the downward sloping demand curve. Basically what you see here is that you can be quite profitable, even more profitable as a monopolist than you would be in a competitive market. Not surprising, but here's just some of the calculus to illustrate that. So if you could coordinate, if you could act like a monopolist by coordinating with others, forming a cartel, for example, that can be very, very profitable. So there are examples of explicit price and market fixing. Cartels are these classic examples. You think about OPEC, the oil producing states that get together and try, in their case, to restrict supply as a way to raise prices and control prices. Why isn't this illegal? Well, it's not illegal because it doesn't fall into one jurisdiction or institutional area. In fact, this is often states, governments that are arguing to do this as a way to raise prices for those countries. Now, if you did that just within, for example, the US, this type of price fixing is illegal. We don't allow for discussions about pricing. In fact, we don't allow for discussions about what we call their functional equivalents. Let's say dividing up the country into different geographic domains where you compete in one versus the other. So these are just simply activities that are not allowed. It's not to say that there haven't been attempts. In fact, the airline industry, there was a famous attempt where the CEO of American Airlines at the time called up one of his competitors and basically in a explicitive tyrant on the on the answering machine said, raise your prices. This is simply not allowed, especially leaving that on the answering machine. This was found and brought to the attention of authorities there. Not a smart activity. The other thing to consider is that some actions are judged by the rule of reason, which says a balance between what are the competitive implications of this type of action versus are there other reasons that we would want to allow it from a kind of general welfare standard here. In recent years, there have been accused examples of price fixing. I think they're somewhat interesting. Many years ago, the Ivy League was accused of price fixing in terms of their financial aid packages because they were coordinating in terms of what they were giving for various students, in essence setting price for college. This was disallowed. And the U.S. airline industry has also been accused of this through their reservation systems in which they all pool together information as a way, arguably, to try to coordinate on price. Once again, these are not allowed. What is allowed is various forms of tacit coordination. The challenge, of course, is these tacit coordination, this idea of we'll argue and hold prices high without actually talking to one another, is very difficult to maintain. It suffers from what we call in economics the prisoner's dilemma. It is simply the idea that if you had two prisoners who committed a crime together and you bring them into a cell and actually split them into two separate rooms, you try to get each of them to rat each other out. And the challenge, of course, is as the individual prisoners, is it would be better if you both keep your mouths shut and not rat each other out, but you're not sure if the other one is going to do that to you. And that incentive to basically do so leads both of them to basically finger the other one in terms of committing the crime. In terms of pricing, it's the same thing in that I'd like to keep my prices up, but I'm so worried that someone else will undercut me in price, it then devolves into a price war. There might, however, be structural factors that push back on this, this tendency to go to the lowest common denominator. The number of competitors, once again, just simply how many people are out there within the industry. The fewer there are, the more likely that prices might be able to stay a little higher. And this is our concentration ratio that I mentioned earlier. It can be a way of measuring this. Are there a few dominant competitors? Our Herfindahl index is a slightly better measure of this. If there's one dominant competitor, it might be the case that when they set prices, others simply follow. They know, they recognize them as the market leader, and as a result, follow their prices rather than trying to undercut them. One might look at McDonald's in the fast food industry, and then perhaps their competitors watch them and see how they how they price. And finally, there's this notion of similarity in competitors. The more similar competitors are within an industry in terms of their background, their history, and the like, there might just somewhat be an understanding of what the going market price is in a given market. And that might be a way that prices stay high. Third thing to think about are these facilitating devices. There's actually different strategic ways in which firms might try to hold prices up. Very counterintuitively, there's even been those who suggest that the threat of price wars is in itself a way actually to keep prices up. There's a strategy that's referred to as tit for tat that will keep our prices up, but as one firm starts to cut their prices, we all cut in punishment, but then we bring them back up again and everyone goes back to a more stable and more a better position in terms of pricing. If you think about airline price wars, they often have this dynamic where one firm will cut prices in an attempt to increase demand, others will respond in kind. There's suddenly a price war, your friend's calling you on the phone and saying, now's the time to get those tickets. Eventually the prices creep back up, however. Interesting question, or an interesting point perhaps. And then finally, there are things like best price clauses. It says things like, I will meet any of my competitors' prices here in terms, let's say, of electronics retailer. What those best price clauses might do is it might discourage your rivals from trying to undercut you in price, and then everybody keeps prices higher as a result. So once again, there are some of these facilitating devices. They don't always work, but they may be a way to increase the tacit coordination with an industry, keeping prices higher and undermining some of the rivalry that will make an industry less profitable. So once again, we have these 5 forces here. When you do a 5 forces analysis, one of the greatest challenges here is to think through the totality of the pros and cons you see within the industry. It would be rare to find an industry where all the forces are working either positively for the industry or working against the industry. And so the real art of a 5 forces analysis is trying to balance between those various types of pressures that you find and making arguments at the end of the day about which ones you think are more salient and why. Now, there are many critiques of the 5 forces analysis. One of them is simply that the 5 forces aren't enough. There are other factors that we need to consider, and I think that's definitely the case. This is definitely a necessary but not sufficient tool when doing a strategic analysis. 2 simple ones I'd like to highlight here. One is the role of complements. Complements are a little bit different than supply. These are things like software to a hardware manufacturer here. Though it's not a direct supplier, the success of the software company helps drive the success of the hardware company. So who has bargaining power in terms of complements? Sometimes they work together, and sometimes, of course, they might work at odds with one another. So thinking through the role of complements might be an additional thing you want to think through in terms of industry structure. The second one you want to think about is the role of institutions. Now, by institutions, we mean those who basically make the rules of the game here, and the most obvious candidate would be government in terms of government policy and the like. I've mentioned a few times about things like antitrust policy in the U.S. Antitrust policy is there to prevent the inappropriate use of market power within a marketplace here, using a monopoly to your advantage. And so it's good to know how institutions can shape the competitive context within an industry, how it can shape the degree to which some of these things about rivalry and tacit coordination and the like are possible or not. So let me end with the following lessons. First off, a key task to any strategic analysis is to identify and address the competitive forces that limit economic rents. 5 forces analysis is one of the most valuable tools in your strategist toolkit. It helps you understand, again, whether an industry is attractive or not, and to help you understand perhaps where there are opportunities to create barriers of competition that allow firms to avoid this fundamental principle problem that we've discussed of going down to the competitive, perfectly competitive market where no firm makes economic rents. So some things to think about broadly. Entry. We would like less entry that makes an industry more attractive. And it's less likely when incumbent firms have a competitive advantage that makes it hard for potential entrants to compete, and that they can incredibly retaliate against new entrants in this industry. Second thing, substitutes. Substitutes are less likely when switching costs are high, making it difficult to switch away from existing products. And this cross-price elasticity is low. Once again, you really demand one product class versus another. Third thing, buyer and supplier power depend on relative concentration, this power differential here in terms of numbers and scarcity. The viability of alternatives, to what degree do the buyers or suppliers have the ability to play off one another, And information availability again. And this gets to our ideas of price discrimination. Like the more informed a buyer is, the more power they have in a relationship. And that applies both to a buyer, to a focal firm and industry, and from that focal firm and industry to the suppliers as well. And then finally, rivalry amongst existing competitors is more intense when the incentives to fight are large and tacit coordination is difficult. And in particular, the simplest thing to think about is how many firms are within the industry. If there's a lot of firms within the industry, rivalry will be more intense. Fewer firms in the industry, all things being equal, rivalry will be less intense. The industry will be more favorable. So let me end there. Thank you for taking the time to go through this lecture today, and thank you very much.